Hello there and welcome to this game review. Happy holidays as well. So in this one we will talk a bit about statics and dynamics and the nature of the Marat-Sebaen structure and why against it we must play as actively as possible as soon as possible. And also this is quite an old game and I would generally suggest analyzing the newest games that you have because the ideas that you had during the game the thought processes are still kind of fresh, so you wouldn't have forgotten what was going on. Of course, old games are good too, but if there's a choice, I would suggest newer games. So we have the symmetrical English, and Black plays this move d5, which is quite ambitious. Black wants to be the first one to strike in the center, even though he doesn't have as many pieces developed, which means White should punish him by opening up the center and attacking as soon as possible, while Black does not have time to consolidate his space advantage. Because Black has the idea of developing with knight c6 and e5, and this way they will have the Marozzi bind, which in the long term is good for Black. Here White played knight takes d5, which is a bit weird to develop the opponent's queen so easily. Instead, White has a few approaches. The most simple is probably to play d4, which makes the most sense because White has more pieces developed. Now the threat is to probably take the pawn. A few structures can arise. If here, then White has a strong center. If here, then White can develop the queen. Now if this is taken at the end of this, White has two developed pieces against 0. Black will have a hard time developing the king side, and White can finish development and try to start some kind of attack. So instead knight d5, g3, and now White finishes their development, but the problem is Black is slowly consolidating, and more or less he needs a few moves. He should develop this bishop, play f6, b6, develop this rook, and castle, and then Black will have an advantage because they have set up the Marozzi bind. So White has to do something as soon as possible. So d3 is logical, we have to make this move anyway. Bishop e7, now b3. But this is extremely slow, and the bishop on b2 will not be very good, because Black should play f6, and the bishop will be blunted. So already Black has an advantage, because White was too slow. Instead, White should create threats as soon as possible. Bishop e3, developing the bishop in one move, instead of two, also vacating the square for the rook. Let's say castles, rook c1 can be played, and White has the threat here already, and it's not that easy to deal with. For example, if b6, White has the typical tactic, knight takes e5, because Black was not in time to finish development on the queen side, so White can exploit this. So Black must play knight d4 here, changing the structure. White can take with the knight, opening up this bishop. Black can take either like this or like this. In either case, White will have enough dynamic counterplay. For example, if here, then this is a bad structure for White, but if he plays actively and soon plays e3 or b4 or something like that, then he will be fine. Also, Black still hasn't developed the pieces. Again, if he does, then White will be worse. So White would have to play quite quickly, something like e3 at some point. Not here because g5 traps the bishop, but for example h4. Next move can be e3. Next we can exchange, play d4, and White will eventually probably have some small advantage because of the better placed bishops. Otherwise, if Black takes like this, then now the c file is for White, bishop d2. Next, White can try to play rook c4 or something, queen b3, rook fc1, trying to invade on c7. And again, if Black doesn't get developed, he will be worse. So we want to attack as soon as possible. So White should play very actively here before Black is able to finish their development and set up the Marozzi bind. Instead b3, and here Black is now better because he is able to finish development. This has the threat of knight c4, and Black kind of ignores the threat and plays f5, which is way too aggressive and a big positional mistake, creating a big weakness on e5. Instead, after f6, Black can now pre-maneuver his pieces, though here I guess knight e4 is blundered so f6 should be played a bit later. Black can play, for example, queen d7 to avoid any tempos. Now if knight c4, simply f6. If knight e4, simply b6. Black will play f6 as well. And in general, once he gets both of these moves in, white will be out of counterplay. He will have to do something desperate like f4. And generally, black's plan will be at some point to put a knight on d4, probably recapture of the e-pawn or the c-pawn, depending on the situation. And then black will be better due to simple Maróczy bind structure. But after f5, after knight c4, black is losing material. He could give up the bishop, but this would be a huge concession. After b takes towards the center, white has this huge unopposed bishop. The b file can also be used. Bishop c3 with a4, a5 is also an idea, so white is clearly better. At queen c7 now, white wins a pawn. And this bishop is quite important, but as long as f5 is played, this bishop cannot go anywhere. So bishop c6 and knight takes e5. So at the end of this, white is a pawn ahead, but black does have the bishop there. And if he gets time to do something like this, activating his light squared bishop, then black will have enough compensation. Queen d2. So the first step of realizing a pawn advantage is to minimize counterplay and consolidate. So this is what white is doing, developing the queen. And now most piece exchanges will favor white. Bishop f6, queen e3. f4 is something that we were going to play anyway, probably at some point, to solidify this square. So we could have just played it here, but okay, queen e3, b6, f4, bishop c8. So this is what black is trying to do. Queen f3, trying to exchange queens. Black doesn't want to. Knight c4, and this exchanges the dark squared bishops. But there's no real point to doing that, as this bishop is not really threatening anything. If black ever takes here, then the opposite colored bishop situation also kind of favors white, because his bishop is no worse than black's. But okay, knight c4, exchanging pieces makes sense. Now rook c to d1, bit abstract. Maybe the knight should just go back to e5, as it doesn't really have much else to do. After bishop b7, queen f2, we are not allowing black to create a battery over here, and slowly but surely white should play stuff like b4 to start opening up the position to try to win the game. Okay, rook d1, e4. Now the structure changes. This is kind of a weakness, but it's defendable. And after rook e8, white makes a strange move, queen c3, which simply leaves this pawn to hang. And generally, we shouldn't give up pawns for no reason. I understand this is maybe a bit uncomfortable to defend, but it's still possible. The simple move rook f to e1 should be considered. It's not clear what exactly black is going to do here. How is he going to attack this pawn? If here we can always block it with knight e5, we have this great square. And even though black has the strong bishop, the bishop alone cannot really do anything. So queen c3, now the bishop takes on e4, and now the position is more or less equal because black has the strong bishop. Now that this pawn is gone, no one is blocking it. Knight e5, rook e7, but this blunders a very simple tactic, a tactic in one move, which you found in the second try, but we should really find queen c4 all the time, because this is the only check in the position, and it turns out to be a fork. So checks, captures, and attacks, this is something that we should always be looking at, and this wins the game. Rook d2 was played, trying to double the rooks, which makes sense positionally. After rook d6 now, this is allowed again, queen c4. So now we are up a piece and the game is just over. Black has no counterplay, there's no real chances to save the game. So you managed to win quite smoothly from here in a couple of moves. So quite an interesting game, and I think it's important to understand from this position that white should play very actively. If he doesn't play actively and he doesn't create threats, then black will slowly set up the Maróczy bind and have an advantage because of the strong center. So before that happens, we must not allow him and create threats. So hopefully this was useful, and see you next time.